Imagine this 120 luxuries sprouting up on your land overnight like mushrooms after a rainy day. The HOA president smiling. Lawyers and expensive suits laughing at your innocent mistake. Well, they missed one tiny detail. I'm a forensic accountant with 15 years specializing in property fraud. By the way, where are you watching from? Leave your city below. I bet your HOA horror stories are just as wild. What they did not realize was that every brick they erected was building their own prison cell. Allow me to tell you how I made their greed the ultimate satisfying legal trap ever. The day I returned from my 6-month consulting project in London, the Arizona sun was especially warm on my face. I was Brian Jordan, 45, and finally ready to settle down at last on the 50 acres my Aunt Margaret had left me. The Uber driver kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror as we pulled up to what was supposed to be empty desert land. "Sir, are you sure this is the address? This looks like a whole new development," he said. Slowing down, my heart sank as I saw row after row of cookie-cutter beige homes, where my aunt's fields of wildflowers once were 120 homes with immaculately manicured lawns, and HOA-approved mailboxes sat on my property. The Emerald Heights subdivision sign mocked me with its glittering gold letters. I paid the driver and walked straight to the sales office where a perky blonde realtor bounced up to meet me. "Welcome to Emerald Heights. Would you like to tour our Phase 2 homes? We're already 70% sold." I pulled out my property deed. "I'm wondering why there are houses on my land." Her smile faltered, then returned to its brightness. "Oh, you must be Mr. Jordan Melanie Ross. Our HOA president has been waiting for you. She said you might be a bit confused about the development agreement." The sales office was a temple of suburban decadence, marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and walls covered with architectural drawings of an even larger development. Phase 2 would clearly include a golf course and country club on my land. The realtor, whose name tag read Brittany, fiddled nervously at her computer. "Mrs. Ross said to send you right up if you stopped by. Her office is on the second administration building floor." She pointed to a gleaming glass building that looked more like a corporate headquarters than an HOA office. As I walked through the development, I noticed the things that my forensic accountant's eye automatically cataloged. The streets were all named after precious gems: Sapphire Lane, Ruby Court, Diamond Drive. Each home had the identical beige stucco exterior, with slight variations in trim color. The landscaping was immaculate but sterile, with not a leaf out of place. Residents were walking dogs or jogging by, all eyeing me suspiciously. I was obviously an outsider in what had been my own property. I met Melanie in her upscale office, where she surreptitiously demanded the development was by the book. She was 52, with impeccably styled silver hair and the predatory smile of someone who'd gotten away with murder in the past. Behind her desk was her law degree from Stanford and a couple of civic awards strategically placed to intimidate visitors. "Brian, so glad you could join us at last," she purred, sliding a fat folder across her mahogany desk. "As you can see, we sent a number of notices to your address of record about the development plans." When we heard nothing, we proceeded according to the HOA bylaws your aunt signed when Emerald Heights was first developed back in 1998. She opened the folder to reveal page after page of legal documents, certified mail receipts, public notices. It was all done by the book, I assure you. But registered address, I questioned, flipping through the documents. My blood ran cold when I saw it. 1223 Maple, Drive, my aunt's old house, which had been demolished 2 years earlier following her death. The certified mail receipts all showed delivery attempted. No such address. Melanie's eyes gleamed with triumph. The address we have on record with the HOA. We did everything according to the book, Brian. Every notice, every deadline, every opportunity for you to object, all duly noted and sent to that address. She leaned back in her leather chair. "I know this is a lot to absorb, but the development is a fait accompli now. Perhaps we can discuss compensation for your cooperation?" I studied her face, seeing the slight twitch at the corner of her mouth, a story I'd heard in hundreds of fraud cases. "You knew that address wasn't current anymore," I said softly. Her smile didn't waver. We have to go with the address we have on file. It's not our job to track down property owners who didn't have the decency to leave a forwarding address. She pulled out another document your aunt signed, this HOA agreement. In 1998, clearly stating that all official communications would be directed to the address of record. I stood up, keeping my poker face, a skill honed from years of auditing financial fraud. I'll need to go over these documents with my attorney. Melanie's smile widened. Naturally, but I should let you know that it would be expensive and futile to contest this. We have Morrison's backing, Keller and Associates. You might have heard of them, I had. They were the legal pit bulls who'd crushed 3 environmental groups trying to stop a pipeline last year. As I was leaving her office, I heard her telling her assistant, "He'll fold, they always do." As I walked back through the development, I noticed more details. Security cameras on every corner, a guardhouse and a gated entrance that was patrolled by a security car on private rounds. This was not a housing development. This was a fortress. My aunt's 50 acres had turned into a controlled environment where every aspect of life was regulated. I stopped at the spot where her favorite oak tree used to be. Now it was an ornamental fountain with benches bolted into concrete. That night, I sat in my hotel room, surrounded by papers and my laptop, doing what I did best, following the money. Something in Melanie's confidence bothered me. It wasn't arrogance. It was the certainty of someone who'd been here before I started with public records. And within hours, I'd found my first breadcrumb. Melanie Ross, formerly. Melanie Ross Hutchinson Attorney Registration, suspended in 2016 for conduct, including dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or misrepresentation. The plot was thickening, and I hadn't even started looking into the HOA's finances yet. My cell phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Heard you're back in town. If you want the lowdown on Emerald Heights, meet me at Java Junction tomorrow at 10 a.m. A friend, I smiled. Anonymous friends in my life usually equaled someone who had a guilty conscience or a grudge to bear. Either way, they always had the best information. I responded with a simple, "I'll be there," and returned to my research. By 3 a.m., I'd mapped out 15 other properties that had inexplicably landed in Emerald Heights laps in the past 5 years. The pattern was clear. Old owners, out-of-state heirs, and always those notices sent to outdated addresses. Java Junction was a small, quaint coffee shop on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where locals knew everyone, and strangers stood out like sore thumbs. It was selected, I surmised deliberately, far enough from Emerald Heights to discourage observation, busy enough to provide cover. I arrived early, ordered a black coffee, and chose a corner booth where I had a view of the entrance. The morning crowd was a mix of construction workers grabbing breakfast and retirees discussing the world's problems over unlimited refills. At exactly 10 a.m., a young woman in a crisp navy suit walked in, scanning the room anxiously. When her eyes met mine, she nodded slightly and walked over. "Mr. Jordan, I'm Allison West. I believe I can assist you with your problem." She sat down in the booth across from me, her hands shaking a little as she placed her briefcase on the table. Closer up, I could notice the dark circles beneath her eyes, which were half concealed by skillfully applied makeup. This was a person who was not sleeping well. "I worked for Melanie at one time," she started, dropping her voice. "Right out of law school, I thought I'd landed my dream job with a high-powered lawyer. She was brilliant, charismatic, everything I wished I could be." Allison pulled out a folder. Then I discovered what she was really doing. The Emerald Heights HOA is not your typical homeowners association. It's a sophisticated property acquisition scheme. Melanie finds vulnerable properties, uses obscure HOA bylaws to justify takeover, then works with developers to flip the land for huge profits. She opened the folder, displaying painstakingly arranged papers, emails, financial records, internal memos. I started to see discrepancies about 6 months into the job. Properties being added to the HOA control without proper authorization. Elderly homeowners signing papers they didn't understand, forged signatures on significant paperwork. Her voice hardened. When I went to Melanie with my concerns, she laughed, said I was naive that this was how business was done in the real world. I leaned forward. Why come to me? Why not go to the authorities? Allison's laugh was bitter. I tried, but Melanie's well-connected. She's got judges, city councilors, even some FBI agents in her pocket. When I threatened to tell on her, she got me blacklisted, said I was a disgruntled employee, spreading false rumors. No company in 3 states will hire me now. She pushed the folder toward me, but I made copies of everything, including evidence that she knew your aunt had died when she sent those notices. She pulled up a specific email 3 months before I got notification of the development. Look at this conversation between Melanie and her assistant. She plainly says that the old lady is dead and instructs her team to proceed and send notices to the invalid address. She even jokes about it, calls it fishing in a dry pond. I read the email thread, my fury building with each word. The callousness was staggering. The papers were incriminating. Email chains between Melanie and her developer partner, Jim the Hammer Harrison, on how to speed up the takeover of my property. Financial records showing millions in offshore accounts. But most interesting was a technical report on environmental assessments. What's this about soil contamination? I asked. Allison smiled for the first time. That's your ace in the hole. Melanie was in such a hurry to build, she skirted environmental tests. Those houses, they're on land that needed to be cleaned up first. Every permit they obtained was obtained under false pretenses. There's more, Allison continued, pulling out another batch of documents. Your aunt wasn't some kind of innocent victim. She'd been fighting Melanie for years. Read these letters, correspondence between your aunt and various regulatory agencies. Complaints filed with the State Bar Association. Even a report from a private detective. I scanned the documents, seeing my aunt's handwriting on letter after letter. She'd known all along what was happening and had been building a case. In the course of the next 2 hours, Allison laid out the entire operation. The HOA would identify properties with absentee or deceased owners, send legally required notices to addresses they knew were inactive invalid, then use the failure to respond to invoke abandonment rights under an obscure section of the original HOA charter. They'd partner with Jim Harrison's development company Construct quickly with inferior materials and shortcuts, then sell to unsuspecting buyers before anyone could challenge the legis. They've done it to 15 other properties, she said. But you're different. You have the ability to reverse this, and more importantly, you came back before they could unload all the houses. The timing is everything, she said, pulling out a timeline she'd created. Melanie usually waits at least a year after she's taken control before anyone knows what's happened. By then, she sold most of the properties, created a complex web of ownership, and made it almost impossible to untangle the deals. But you came only 6 months in. She sold some units, but not enough to make the situation irreversible. That's why she's panicking. Why should I trust you? I asked, studying her face. This could still be an elaborate trap. Allison met my gaze steadily. Because I'm the reason you inherited that property in the first place. Your aunt was my law school mentor. She knew what Melanie had been planning and changed her will specifically to leave the property to someone who could defend herself. She always said you were the smartest one in the family, that you'd notice what others wouldn't. She pulled out a handwritten letter. She left this for you in case something like this happened. My aunt's familiar handwriting blurred as I read. Dear Brian, if you're reading this, then Melanie Ross has made her move. I've watched her circle like a vulture for years, waiting for me to die. The land isn't just property, it's evidence. Look beneath the old oak tree near the creek. I've hidden something that will help you take her down. Trust Allison. She's one of the good ones. Love, Aunt Margaret. I folded the letter with care. Looks like we have some digging to do. There's something else you need to know, Allison said as we prepared to leave. Ellie's not in this by herself. She's part of a network that reaches through several states. The Emerald Heights model being duplicated in Nevada, New Mexico, and Utah. They're targeting retirement communities, places with older populations, wherever they can exploit property laws and HOA regulations. Your aunt caught on, which is why she became such a threat. She wasn't just fighting for her own property, she was trying to take down a multi-state criminal operation. That afternoon, armed with shovels and determination, Allison and I unearthed my aunt's insurance policy, a waterproof box containing original HOA documents, recorded conversations, and a diary of all the suspicious activity she'd observed. But the bombshell was a series of geological surveys from 1997 showing natural gas deposits under the property. "That's why Melanie wants the land so badly," Allison whispered. "It's not just about the houses she'll sell the mineral rights to Excelsior. Energy for $50 million when she has full control." I spent the evening working out a detailed timeline of Melanie's fraud. The pattern was clear, but patterns weren't going to be enough for court. I needed evidence that would be admissible, and I needed Melanie to incriminate herself. That's when inspiration struck. "Allison, how would you like to play double agent?" I asked. She lifted an eyebrow. "What did you have in mind?" I outlined my plan. Allison would approach Melanie pretending she wanted back in so she could assist in taking care of the Brian Jordan problem. In the meantime, I'd play the frazzled heir willing to settle for pennies on the dollar. The HOA meeting was held in the community center, a gleaming building
that my rent money had obviously paid for. The room was packed with residents, most of them staring at me like I was the villain in this drama. Melanie was at the podium, looking confident in her power suit. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," she began. "As you are all aware, we have a situation regarding the ownership claims being made by Mr. Brian Jordan." She gestured in my direction. "While we can comprehend his confusion, the fact of the matter is that this complex was built legally and in good faith." I stood up to my feet, playing my role to perfection. "I just want what's right," I said, letting my voice shake slightly. "My aunt left me this land, and now there are houses on it. I don't want to uproot families, but definitely there's some compensation due." The crowd murmured in sympathy. "Some for me most," against Melanie's smile was condescending. "Of course, Brian. We're happy to offer you $200,000 for any residual claims you might have. That's more than reasonable, considering the development was approved through the proper channels. 200,000. I repeated, then looked down at my papers, as if the land was worth at least $5 million. Undeveloped, Melanie's eyes flashed. "Worth it, Mr. Jordan." Past tense. Things are different now. That's when Jim Harrison stood up from the front row. He was a large man with the kind of tan that developed on golf courses, not building sites. "Look, buddy," he drawled. "You can take the deal, or you can spend the next 10 years in court. My choice." I allowed the silence to linger, then pulled out my phone. Before making a decision, there's something everyone needs to hear. I played the recording Allison had made yesterday when she'd gone to talk to Melanie. Melanie's voice rang out through the room. "Of course I knew the old bat was dead. That's why I sent the notices there. Brian Jordan was sipping tea and eating crumpets in London, likely. By the time he'd have figured out what was going on, we'd have everything sewn up tight." The room erupted. Residents started shouting questions. Melanie's face went from red to white. That's taken out of context?" she stammered, but I wasn't done. "I also have copies of the environmental reports themselves, the ones that outline contamination levels 3 times the legal limit, the ones that you hid from these families who bought homes here." Now the residents were on their feet demanding answers. Jim Harrison tried to slip out the side door but found it blocked by Connell Lewis, my childhood next-door neighbor who'd become one of Emerald Heights' residents. "I don't think so," Jim Connell said firmly. "We all need to hear this." Melanie tried to regain control. "This is ridiculous. He's obviously fabricated these recordings. I'll be pressing charges for defamation first thing tomorrow morning." But the doubt was racing through the room like wildfire. I brought forth additional documents. "Speaking of legal issues, does anybody know that HOA funds have been spent to support Melanie's own legal defense in 3 separate cases of fraud, or that the builder of your homes has filed bankruptcy twice under different names?" The meeting dissolved into chaos. Melanie fled to her office with Jim close behind. A cluster of residents trapped me, seeking more. "How far does this go?" A young father with an infant in his arms demanded, "Are our homes safe?" I chose my words carefully. "I'm working with officials to get to the bottom of this. Your homes are safe, structurally, but there are issues that need to be taken care of. I promise you my fight is not with any of you. It's with those people who defrauded all of us. That night, Allison called with news. Melanie's losing it. She's moving money to offshore accounts and burning documents. But here's the interesting part. She called someone she referred to as the senator, told him the situation was getting out of control. I smiled grimly. Good packet, people do make errors. What about our federal friends? Allison's voice was lively. The FBI agent you phoned. He's definitely interested. It seems they've been building a case against Jim Harrison for money laundering, but couldn't connect him to Melanie until now. I had just hung up, when my laptop chimed with an email from an anonymous address. Back off, or things will get very unpleasant for you. You don't know who you're dealing with. It contained a photo of my Boston home. I forwarded it straight to the FBI and texted Allison. Looks like we're rattling the right cages. Her response was immediate. Melanie just offered me $1 million to steal your evidence and disappear. Want me to take it? I laughed out loud. Absolutely, let's see how she plans to pay you. The next morning was a flurry of activity. Melanie had obtained an emergency injunction to keep me from harassing residents and spreading false information, but she'd made a deadly mistake. In her haste, she'd included financial documents that helped to substantiate my claims. Her lawyer, a nervous
young man who couldn't keep his hands off his tie, realized the mistake too late. Judge Patricia Reeves, a no-nonsense property law approach, raised an eyebrow as she scanned the file. Counselor, did you actually read these attachments before you filed them? The young lawyer, whose name tag read Kevin Marsh, blushed. Your Honor, we filed these documents under a very tight time constraint. My client felt it was essential to protect the community from Judge Reeves cut him off. From what exactly? From learning the truth about their homes. I'm looking at bank records here that show multiple transfers from HOA accounts to offshore entities. Is your client aware that financial disclosure in court pleadings is subject to perjury laws? Melanie at the defendant's table was frantically whispering to a senior partner who just walked in Richard Blackstone, the legendary shark of Arizona. Real property law withstood smoothly? Your Honor, if I may step in for my colleague. There's been a misunderstanding as to the breadth of these documents, but Judge Reeves would have none of it. Mr. Blackstone, I don't care if you're substituting counsel. These documents are now public record. They reflect clear evidence of financial improprieties worthy of investigation. Meanwhile, Melanie was proceeding faster than a cat on a hot roof. She'd managed to sell 80 of the 120 homes to unsuspecting purchasers, pushing closings through as fast as possible. But rather than closing her down, I was letting her make her hole that much deeper. Every sale created a new victim, a new person who's standing to sue her. Each rushed closing had meant more paperwork mistakes, more proof of fraud. Allison, playing her role to perfection, was providing me with inside information while pretending to assist Melanie in covering her tracks. That afternoon, I went to the county recorder's office with a forensic auditor I'd hired Patricia knew in. She was a real estate fraud and had helped the FBI in many high-profile cases. We sifted through the deeds and transfer documents. Patricia whistled low. Brian, this is worse than we thought. Look at these signatures. She indicated a set of documents. Same notary on all of them, but the notary's license expired 3 years ago. Every single one of these sales is suspect legally. I looked at the documents more closely and look at the timing. All these closings took place over a 72-hour period. No legitimate real estate business closes this many sales, this fast without proper due diligence. Patricia nodded. It's a clear pattern of fraudulent conveyance. She's trying to create so many different property claims. It's impossible to unravel the transactions. Classic asset protection tactic, but so amateurishly executed, it's creating more evidence. She's getting desperate, Allison reported at one of our secret meetings at a truck stop on the edge of town. She's pressuring buyers to close without inspections, offering huge discounts for cash sales. And I think she's forging signatures on disclosure forms. She gave me a flash drive. I copied everything before she could dispose of it, including emails where she specifically tells Jim to use substandard materials in an effort to cut costs. Oh, and one more thing. She pulled out a folder marked Conf. These are internal HOA communications about something called Project Clean Sweep. Apparently, Melanie's had been planning to demolish the older section of Emerald Heights where your aunt's house was and build a luxury resort. The ecological ruin was going to be her excuse for condemning the properties and compelling sales at below market value. My indignation was building, so she contaminates the land, utilizes the poison to press the people out, then profits from redevelopment. Allison nodded grimly. Exactly, and she's been using HOA funds to pay off environmental inspectors to look the other way. The corruption was worse than I'd thought. I spent the rest of the day making a detailed flowchart of Milan's operations, tracing the money through a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts. By dusk, I had linked 3 city council members, 2 state lawmakers, and a federal judge to the connections. The trend was obvious. Melanie had built a network of corruption that reached into every level of government. But webs have one weakness. They're only as strong as their weakest thread. That evening, I received a call from Special Agent David Chen of the FBI. Mr. Jordan, we've been following developments. We'd like to get together 2 hours later. I was sitting in an unmarked office building, staring at a wall covered with photographs and papers, a huge web with Melanie and Jim at its center. We've been investigating Harrison for 18 months, Chen said. But Ross was always one step ahead, too cautious until now. He pointed to an image of a gray-haired, dignified-looking man, Senator William Thornton. We believe he's been providing political cover for their operations in exchange for campaign contributions. The senator, I remembering Allison's briefing, Chen nodded. Exactly. Your evidence could be the end of the entire network. But we need you to take a chance. He outlined their plan. I would meet with Melanie while wearing a wire and arrange to pay off. The plan was to attempt to get her to admit to the greater conspiracy. She's smart, I warned. She'll be suspicious. Chen grinned tightly. That's why we're going to allow her to believe she's getting away with it. The trap was sprung on Friday afternoon, but on Thursday night, everything almost fell apart. Jim Harrison, perhaps smarter or more paranoid than we'd given him credit for, smelled a rat. He confronted Allison in the HOA office after hours accusing her of being a spy. The confrontation turned physical when he grabbed her arm. What Jim didn't know was that Allison had been recording everything on her phone. His threats, his admission that they had had problems with Brian in the past, and most damning of all, his assertion that the senator will bury all of you. Allison managed to escape and went straight to the FBI office. By Friday morning, we had a new problem. Jim had vanished along with $5 million from the HOA accounts. Melanie was more than panicked now. She was desperate, which made her dangerous, but also disheveled. When I walked into her office that afternoon, with a wire taped beneath my shirt, she didn't even try to be courteous. "What do you want, Jordan?" she snarled. The shiny facade was gone, replaced by bare survival instinct. "I want to end this," I said softly. "You've sold most of the houses. You've made your money. I'll take 10 million and sign anything you wish." Her eyes narrowed. 10 million. You're insane, but I could see she was calculating, balancing the risk and the cost. 5 million, she countered. And you sign an NDA. You never speak about this again. I feigned consideration, then shook my head. 8 million, and I want it in cash tonight. She laughed, but it was a brittle sound. Cash. What do you think, this is a movie? But I could see the wheels turning. Cash meant no paper trail. Cash meant she could pay me with the money Jim had stolen. I know Jim took the HOA funds, I said quietly. I also know you have access to other accounts, offshore accounts in the Caymans. Perhaps her face went white. How do you? She caught herself, but it was too late. Here's what's going to happen. I went on. You're going to pay me 8 million in cash. I'm going to disappear, and you're going to pray. I stay gone for a moment. I thought she might call my bluff. Then her shoulders sagged. Tonight, 10 p.m., the old warehouse on Route 47. Come alone, word of the embezzled. HOA money tore through Emerald Heights like wildfire. Residents were in a panic by Saturday morning, gathering in groups and demanding answers. I held an emergency meeting at the community center, this time with a much different tone. I know you're concerned. I began looking out over the sea of anxious faces. You've put your life savings into these houses. You're afraid you'll lose everything. Murmurs of assent ripples through the crowd. I wish you to know that my fight is with Melanie Ross and Jim Harrison, not you. Actually, I need your help to see justice served. I briefly recap the situation. Simply how Melanie had cheated a number of homeowners, how the homes were built on illegally obtained land, but how the residents themselves were innocent victims. Here is my offer, I said. If you are willing to testify to any irregularities you've witnessed, pressure to close, quickly missing inspections, unusual fees, I'll see to it that your home ownership will not be challenged. In addition, any damages awarded will go into a fund to mitigate the environmental issues and guarantee your property values are sustained. The response was overwhelming. 90% of the homeowners agreed to cooperate. Stories poured out forged documents, threats, bribes. One elderly couple revealed that Melanie had convinced them to invest all of their retirement savings in a special HOA fund that was supposed to yield returns of 15%. Another family discovered their home inspection had been completed before the house was even built. Each story added another brick to the wall of evidence we were building. That evening, as I was preparing for the warehouse meeting, my phone rang. It was Melanie Change of Plans, she said in a voice taut. I'll have someone deliver the money to your hotel. I could sense the fear in her voice. She suspected it was a trap. No deal, I said abruptly. Face to face, or I go public with everything tomorrow morning. The silence hung for long seconds. All right, she spat. But I'm coming with security, I grinned. Bring whoever you like, just bring my money. The warehouse was a big, empty room that once stored farm equipment. Now it was empty, a good place for clandestine meetings. I got there early, checking out other doors and hiding spots. The FBI had wanted to wire the place, but I'd convinced them to stay back. Melanie would take off at the first sight of law enforcement. Instead, I wore a new wired, top-of-the-line equipment that had the capability of transmitting even through concrete walls. At exactly 10 p.m., headlights sliced across the grimy windows. Melanie entered with two hulking men who looked like they bench-pressed compact cars for fun. She was carrying a duffel bag that looked promisingly heavy. $8 million, she said, by way of introduction, dropping the bag at my feet. Count it if you'd like. I unzipped the bag to find stacks of $100 bills. Looks about right, I said casually. Now about that NDA. Melanie pulled out a paper. Sign it, take your money, and disappear. If I ever see you again, if you ever say a word about this to anyone, you'll do what I interrupted. Have I been killed like you did with Thomas Brennan? Her face went pale. Thomas Brennan had been a journalist who'd been investigating HOA corruption 3 years ago. His death had been ruled an accident. I have no idea what you're talking about, she stammered, but her security guards exchanged nervous glances. Oh, really? I pulled out my phone, showing her a photo, because I have a quite interesting email, where you discuss eliminating the Brennan problem once and for all with someone named Victor. That's when everything happened simultaneously. One of her security guards reached for his gun. The warehouse doors flew open. FBI agents descended upon her in guns drawn, and Melanie screamed and tried to run. But there was nowhere to run. As they handcuffed her, she looked at me with pure hatred. You set me up, she yelled. You'll pay for this. I think you're the one who's going to pay. By the way, that money you brought, it's marked. The serial numbers were traced when Jim withdrew it from the HOA account. As they led her away, she turned once again. You don't understand. This is bigger than me. They'll come after you. I watched the FBI car disappear into the night, wondering who they were. But that was a problem for another day. Tonight, justice had been served. The news of Melanie's arrest spread like wildfire. By the following morning, 3 city council members had resigned, and Senator Thornton's office had issued a statement denying any connection with the Emerald Heights scandal. Yeah, right, I thought, just like you'd deny knowledge of those campaign contributions. The federal courthouse was standing room only for Melanie's preliminary hearing. The government had indicted her on 37 counts of fraud money, laundering conspiracy, and racketeering. Jim Harrison had been arrested at the Mexican border with a forged passport and was immediately rolled by the FBI in agreeing to testify against Melanie in exchange for a reduced sentence. But the biggest bombshell came when the prosecutor announced they were also investigating a sitting U.S. senator for corruption. The media went into meltdown. I took the stand on the third day, walking the court through my investigation. The defense attorney Richard Blackstone was known as the Shark, a ruthless litigator who'd never lost a real estate fraud case. He came at me with a predatory smile, his $3,000 suit immaculately tailored. "Mr. Jordan," he began, silky smooth, "isn't it true that you have a personal vendetta against my client? That this entire scenario is nothing more than an elaborate plot to extort money from a successful businesswoman?" I looked him dead in the eye. No counselor, I established this scenario to uncover a criminal enterprise that had swindled millions from innocent people. The only extortion here was perpetrated by your client. Blackstone's smile never wavered. You posed as a forensic accountant, and yet you engaged in fraudulent activities, like wearing a wire and pretending to accept a bribe. How is that not entrapment? Allison, who was seated at the prosecutor's table, passed the chief prosecutor a note. He stood up immediately. "Objection, Your Honor." The defendant offered the first bribe, as is made very clear in the evidence. Judge Carter denied the objection, but Blackstone would not be deterred. He spent the next hour trying to paint me as a callous opportunist, but each attack only allowed me to present additional evidence of Melanie's crimes. The bombshell dropped when I presented my theory of the law. "Your Honor." I began standing up to address the court directly. I'd like to bring the court's attention to the case of Whitmore versus Henderson, 1896. Blackstone rose relevance, Your Honor. We're not here to settle century-old boundary disputes, but Judge Carter was intrigued. I'll allow it continue. Mr. Jordan, I pulled out a leather-bound book of law, a bit of drama but effective. In Whitmore v. Henderson, the state Supreme Court ruled that any structure built on private property without the explicit agreement of the owner becomes the property of the landowner, regardless of the intention or investment of the builder. This decision was reaffirmed in Morrison v. State, 1952, and again in Consolidated Developers v. Williams, 1998. The courtroom went stone silent. Furthermore, I continued Arizona Revised Statute 42-173 specifically holds that improvements made in bad faith are not recoverable by the trespasser. The statute specifically invokes fraudulent conveyance of property rights as grounds for forfeit. Blackstone was frantically flipping through his notes. Your Honor, this is absurd. These are old laws that have not been enforced in years. Judge Carter leaned forward. Actually, Counselor Whitmore versus Henderson was called upon as recently as last year in Peterson versus Maricopa County. Please proceed, Mr. Jordan. I smiled slightly. Thank you, Your Honor. By combining these precedents with the evidence of fraud, we can establish that not only did Miss Ross commit a crime, but she also inadvertently transferred ownership of all improvements, all 120 homes, to me as the rightful landowner. The prosecution team looked stunned. Even Allison seemed surprised, despite the fact that we'd discussed the strategy. Blackstone was turning red. This is ridiculous. You can't seriously expect me to believe that my client built 120 homes to have them taken away on a technicality. I turned to face him squarely. It's not a technicality, counsel. It's the law. The same law your client tried to get around to her own advantage. Melanie clutched Blackstone's arm, hissing loud enough for the court reporter to record. Do something. Call the senator. Tell him if I go down, I'm taking everyone with me. The judge's gavel came down hard. Order Ms. Ross, you will not issue threats in my courtroom, but the damage was already done. Within hours, Senator Thornton's office was raided by the FBI. The trial's second phase focused on environmental fraud. I presented evidence showing that Melanie had bribed inspectors to overlook contamination that made the property unfit for residential development without extensive remediation. The irony, I told the court, is that in her rush to realize a profit, Ms. Ross essentially increased the liability exposure exponentially under the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. She's now personally responsible for cleanup costs, estimated at $30 million. Blackstone tried a last-ditch, desperate tactic. Your Honor, even if we accept Mr. Jordan's interpretation of property law, which we don't, surely the innocent homeowners who purchased these houses in good faith have some rights. It was exactly the opening I'd been waiting for. Absolutely, Counselor. That's why I'm proposing a settlement whereby I sell each house back to its current owner at their original purchase price, minus any misleading fees or kickbacks. All proceeds will go into a remediation fund and victim restitution program. Judge Carter nodded approvingly. A most equitable solution, Mr. Jordan, Mr. West. Does your client accept this offer? Allison stood up every inch the competent attorney. We do, Your Honor. My client's chief interest has never been personal enrichment, but justice for the victims of this fraud. The judge turned to the prosecution. Does the government have any objection to this outline being incorporated in a potential plea agreement? The chief prosecutor stood up. No objection, Your Honor. In fact, we believe Mr. Jordan's suggestion could serve as a model for resolving comparable cases of systematic HOA fraud. Melanie suddenly jumped to her feet, overturning her chair. This is a kangaroo court. You're all in on it. The senator promised me protection. He said the fix was in her outburst, clinched her fate. The judge had her removed from the courtroom and revoked her bail. As order was being restored, I presented my last piece of evidence, a painstaking financial analysis, demonstrating how Melanie had used a web of shell companies to launder money via the HOA. Your Honor, this graph shows that during the past 5 years, approximately $47 million went through these accounts with patterns of classic money laundering schemes. The forensic accountant in me had kept the best until last. A judge recessed court to review the evidence. When court reconvened, her decision was final. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented before us and in light of Miss Ross's own testimony as produced in this court, I have reasonable grounds to proceed with all the charges. Additionally, I'm allowing the plaintiff's motion for ownership of the properties subject to the proposed restitution schedule. As we walked out of the courthouse, Allison turned to me with admiration. That was brilliant. How long have you been working this out? I smiled. Since the day I won Whitmore versus Henderson. Sometimes the best trap is one your adversary sets for herself. Melanie was too busy trying to take advantage of loopholes that she never once considered they would be turned around on her. The evening news had images of Melanie in handcuffs screaming about conspiracy as she was hauled off. The headline in the paper was, HOA President's Greed Becomes Her Prison Landmark Case Sets New Precedent. 3 months later, at Melanie's sentencing hearing, the courtroom was again packed. The judge's words were scathing, Mrs. Ross. You betrayed the trust of hundreds of families, corrupted public officials, and showed a callous disregard for both the law and basic human decency. This court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. As the gavel fell, I thought of Aunt Margaret. Her plan had been flawless. She'd known I'd find the loophole in the law no one else had uncovered. Sometimes the best revenge really was living well. But in this case, it was even better. It was turning their own weapon on them. The final pieces dropped into place within the next 6 months. Like a well-orchestrated symphony. Melanie Ross was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. At her sentencing hearing, she stood before the judge a shell of her former self and read a statement that made national headlines. I allowed greed to blind me to the pain I was causing, she said, her voice hardly above a whisper. I destroyed lives, families, and communities. I can never make complete amends. But I hope my cooperation brings down others like me. Her testimony had actually been instrumental in bringing down a network that spanned 12 states and involved more than 200 corrupt officials. Jim Harrison got off lighter within 15 years because of his early cooperation. He provided detailed financial records that helped reclaim more than $30 million in stolen funds. The real earthquake hit when the trial of Senator William Thornton began. The man who'd once wielded so much power now occupied the defendant's chair on charges that would put him away for life. His fall was Shakespearean in its thoroughness, from esteemed legislator to the poster boy for political corruption in America. As for the 120 homes, the solution was more elegant than anyone expected. I sold each house back to its current resident for exactly what they'd paid, minus any kickbacks or illegitimate fees they'd been charged. The environmental cleanup was completed using money recovered from the criminal enterprise. The land value skyrocketed once people learned about the natural gas deposits, but I'd already taken steps. The mineral rights were placed in a community trust, with profits funding local schools and environmental initiatives in the community. For the next 50 years, Connell Lewis, my neighbor from childhood turned HOA victim, was elected the community association's new president. His first order of business was to rewrite the bylaws to ensure transparency and supermajority approval for any significant decisions. Never again, he told me. Over coffee one morning, we're going to make this a real community, not a scam. The previously suspicious residents of each other had developed over their shared struggle. Block parties replaced HOA meetings, and the community garden flourished, where Melanie's office had stood. Allison West, future changed overnight. The young lawyer who'd been blacklisted was now the in-demand expert on property fraud. She opened her own law firm, specializing in rescuing homeowners from predatory HOAs and corrupt developers. Within a year, she had offices in 3 states and a waiting list of clients. I owe it to your aunt. She told me one day she saw something in me worth saving. We'd found more of Aunt Margaret's letters hidden in the property. She'd been documenting Melanie's activities for years, building a case she knew she wouldn't live to see. Completed former Judge Harold Winter's testimony had opened another Pandora's box. His bountiful explanations of judicial corruption instigated a gargantuan Department of Justice investigation. 17 judges in 6 states indicted, their cases reopened, and hundreds of inappropriate foreclosures overturned. Winters died peacefully in his sleep, 3 months after testifying at last in peace with his conscience. His funeral was attended by many families that he'd rescued via his final act of contrition. The ramifications continued to echo. States began passing new laws to protect homeowners from HOA abuse. The Jordan Amendment, as it became known, required multiple forms of verified notice for any HOA action that would affect property rights. Law schools started teaching courses in HOA governance and property fraud. The Emerald Heights case was required reading in ethics classes, a cautionary tale about how the consolidation of power and greed were capable of corrupting entire institutions. In the anniversary of Melanie's arrest, I stood in the community center in front of a group of residents, local officials, and press. "This victory is for all of us," I said, scanning the faces that had become so familiar over the last year to everyone who stood up, spoke out, and refused to let corruption win. To my Aunt Margaret, who saw this coming and opened the way for justice, and to this community which chose unity over conflict, truth over convenience. After the speeches, when people hugged and shared stories, I stood where my aunt's field of wildflowers used to be. Now it was a playground full of laughing children. Their parents sat on nearby benches, no longer afraid about secret charges or threatened foreclosures. Connell stopped by to bring me a cold beer. "You know, Brian, when you first arrived here, some of us thought you were the enemy. Look at this place now." He gestured with his hand at the thriving community. Sometimes the best revenge is indeed living well, as the sun slipped below Emerald Heights. I thought about the path from that first startling morning to this moment of peace. The forensic accountant in me appreciated the neat resolution of debits and credits, justice weighing in the balance. But the human in me was more profoundly gratified by the community that had sprung up from the ashes of corruption. As I returned to rejoin the celebration, I could almost hear Aunt Margaret's voice in the evening air. "Well done, Brian. Well done indeed." The wildflowers had died, but something even more lovely had taken root. A community built on trust, honesty, and the unshakable belief that justice, Even when late, we'll always find a way to triumph. Looking back, I knew that Melanie had been right about something. She'd fallen into a legal trap, but not one I'd set. It was one she'd built herself, brick by brick, with every fraudulent document, every forged signature, every family she'd tried to destroy. In the end, the very laws she'd twisted to satisfy her greed had recoiled like a rubber band, bringing the poetic justice that makes for the best kind of ending, the kind where the good guys win, the bad guys pay, and a community learns that together, they're stronger than any corrupt system that tries to tear them apart. Sometimes the best revenge really is making their greed your community's windfall. And if you're watching this from a place where HOA horror stories are all too common, remember this document everything, question authority, and never underestimate the power of ordinary people united against injustice. Because in the end, that's what this story is really about. Not just my victory, but ours. The victory of every person who's ever felt powerless against a system designed to crush them. We're proof that with persistence, intelligence, and a little help from friends, even the most powerful Goliaths can